Patrick Rothfuss, the author of the Kingkiller Chronicles, loves stories. That's kind of a no-brainer since he is a writer. No one sits down to write a book unless they love stories, but for Rothfuss, it's more than that. He doesn't just love to experience stories. He loves the idea of them. Like so many other authors, his work has a lot of the trappings people have come to expect in post-Tolkien high fantasy. There's a map containing a number of kingdoms, each with unique languages, customs, and religions for the characters to interact with throughout the story. I actually did this in my own book. It's pretty much standard operating procedure for world building in any kind of fantasy or science fiction. But Rothfuss explores something that I've never seen before. He examines how myths and legends are built in his world, the way they transform through retelling, and the effects that they have on the public consciousness. From the very beginning of the first book, we're introduced to an unusual narrative structure. Now, every book has a narrator. It's the voice that tells you the story.
His smile was one of those rare smiles that you may come across 4 or 5 times in life. It seemed to understand you and believe in you just as you would like to be understood and believed in.
Sorry, old sport, I thought you knew.
But there are different ways a writer can go about doing that. So I'm going to throw a little bit of writing language at you, but trust me, there is a point to it. J.K. Rowling's narration style in the Harry Potter series is what's called third-person limited. That means the story is told by a narrator who is not a character in the story, but somehow knows everything that happens to and around one specific character, including their internal thoughts and feelings. That's how it can say things like, Harry loved to play Quidditch, but he wondered if it was really how he wanted to spend the rest of his life. The narrator is not Harry, but it only knows what he knows, his inner monologue, and everything that he could perceivably observe. There's a variation on this style called third-person omniscient, or the God's Eye. It works basically the same way as third-person limited, except instead of being confined to a single character's perspective, it can know everything. An omniscient narrator can say, Susan was angry that John forgot her birthday, so she threw a vase at him. He ducked in surprise, not understanding the source of her wrath. Sadly, neither of them knew that the shattered vase was all Timothy had to remember his dear grandmother. See, the voice knows everything. It can describe a scene from as many perspectives as the author wants, with all the information the author chooses. It isn't as popular as its cousin these days because it has a tendency to distance the reader from any kind of protagonist, but a lot of classics use this technique. The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne is a popular example. Another style is called first-person limited. This is a narration technique that puts the reader directly in the perspective of a character. Suzanne Collins used it in the Hunger Games trilogy. In those books, Katniss is the narrator, so it sounds more like this. I drew back the bow holding my breath until I knew the shot was perfect. Then I let go. The narration is in the mind of the character, so the reader is as close to their perspective as possible. There are other kinds of narration out there, but these ones are the ones to keep in mind when talking about the Kingkiller Chronicles, because Rothfuss tells his story in 2 distinctive ways. The beginning of each book and certain sporadic chapters are told through a shifting third-person limited. We get Coate the barkeep, Bast the assistant, and Chronicler the scribe, but never more than one of them at a time, and always in third person. The Name of the Wind opens this way, and carries on for the first few chapters until it's revealed that Coate is actually the legendary Kvothe, who Chronicler has been searching for. He's a Robin Hood-like figure that is both legend and folk hero. Chronicler convinces Kvothe to tell him his life story so that the facts can be separated from the fiction. It's at this point that the narrative switches from third person entirely, as Kvothe begins to tell his story in first person. So, Kvothe slammed his hand on the bar becomes I slammed my hand on the bar.
It's the story of a man's life. It's kind of a backstage pass to the myth of the hero. You get to meet this person and then you find out the mythology that surrounds him, and then you find out where that mythology really came from.
Rothfuss pulls this switch off masterfully, so you barely feel the transition. It's completely organic, which makes it easy to miss that something really important just happened. This went from being a story to a story within a story. We, as the reader, have gone from listening to the outrageous legends of Kvothe the Bloodless being told by half-drunk farmers in a tavern, to the actual man's first-hand account. By doing this, the author illustrates the degree of separation that exists between a story and the events that actually transpired. And if that weren't enough, Rothfuss takes this even further. Kvothe, much like the writer who created him, is obsessed with stories. His clan, the Edema Ru, are collectors and keepers of stories, even occasionally accepting them in lieu of money. His primary motivation, which I won't spoil the details of, has to do with tracking down a group of mythological beings. The only way he can do this is by collecting legends and fairy tales about them in order to root out any kernels of truth that might help him. Even the name Kvothe is described as sounding similar to the word quoth, meaning to speak or recite.
Main character, name is Kvothe. 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 Right?
So we are now listening to a character in a story tell his story about how he examines stories to try and separate fact from fiction. If that has your head spinning a little bit, don't worry. When you're reading the books, they aren't actually as convoluted as I'm making them sound. In fact, Kvothe's account of his life is so full of genuine human desire, heartbreak, triumph, sadness, and joy that you lose yourself in his world. And it doesn't matter how many layers of story you've been incepted into. You're right there with him, and that's all that matters. And that's the trick of it. That's the anchor that Rothfuss tethers you to while he repeatedly shows you how untrustworthy stories can be. He does this when we see Kvothe listening to dozens of stories about the same myth being told in dozens of different ways. But we also see this in the way he contributes to his own legend. Having been raised in a theatrical troupe, Kvothe learned at a young age the value of a powerful reputation. He understands that the way people see you affects how they treat you and the opportunities you receive. He earns the name Kvothe the Bloodless by chewing an herb that numbs him and reduces bleeding right before he's scheduled to be whipped in front of his entire school. He does this in order to avoid showing weakness, but the legend later grows until people whisper that he doesn't bleed because he's part demon. And he gently encourages these rumors. He is simultaneously building a legend and attempting to deconstruct one.
Peter S. Beagle is brilliant, and if I had to pick right now at this moment in time, The Last Unicorn has to be probably the best story I've ever read. And then I caught him speaking at a conference that one time, and he said, I never want to write a story like that again. It was too hard, because I realized partway through that I was writing a fairy tale that was also a satire of a fairy tale. And it was like somebody had hit me with lightning, where I realized that's exactly what I had done with my book. It was an epic fantasy. It was also a satire of epic fantasy. And I went, I did write a book like The Last Unicorn, although no one would ever see the comparison except for me.
One of the biggest criticisms that I hear levied against the series is that Kvothe's character is too perfect. He's witty, a good fighter, an intelligent academic, a gifted musician, actor, and con artist. Even the things he's bad at, he either compensates for or quickly learns. To be honest, even I had a hard time suspending disbelief when he basically becomes a sex guru in the second book. But there's two things I feel most people who make this argument forget. The first is that Kvothe eventually becomes the seed for the legendary figure that we later hear whispered about in distant taverns. So while he isn't a god, he is more gifted than the average person, and Rothfuss does a good job justifying this by forcing Kvothe into situations that demand he earn these traits quickly. The second thing people forget is that Kvothe is the one telling the story, and Kvothe is arrogant. He genuinely believes that he is smarter and more talented than nearly everyone he meets. So even if you believe that he is giving a 100% honest account without fabrications or embellishment, we are still reading from his perspective, and it isn't a humble one. With this in mind, we can assume that his exploits may not always be as impressive as he makes them seem. To me, that makes him more realistic. But more importantly, it contributes to the point I made earlier, because Kvothe is not an omniscient narrator. He doesn't know everything, and his version of events is inherently biased, no matter how objective we believe that he is trying to be. This means that the reader is required to treat his account with a certain degree of distrust. We can't always believe Kvothe, but we can understand him, empathize with him, and learn from him.
Right now you have a story, and part of this story exists only in the opposition of two existing possibilities. Either he did or he didn't, right? And as soon as I tell you one, it collapses and it becomes just that story, and you lose something. And as soon as I tell you, I take something away from you as a reader. It's something that I do that not a lot of authors think about a lot. I think about stories in strange ways. But one of the things I think about a lot is what I am leaving the reader that might be taken away in other more conventional types of stories. I don't know if that makes sense.
In the end, that's what all stories are. Pieces of human truth buried in the narratives of the people who tell them. I think the Kingkiller Chronicles are a love letter to stories. They're obviously works of fiction, and I think Rothfuss is trying to give us a deeper understanding of what fiction has always been about. It doesn't matter that things in the stories never actually happened, or that they happened differently. The fact that they aren't factually accurate doesn't make them any less true. Your connections with the characters are what's important. Everything else is just chasing the wind. Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed the video. You're welcome to contact me through my website at codydcampbell.com if you want to talk to me about the Kingkiller Chronicles and share any of your opinions. I know I have a lot of them. You can also read some of my short stories there and get information about my upcoming novel, Sanctuary. Or you can follow me on Twitter at CodyCampbell if you prefer that. If you want to see more videos like this, please leave a like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, everyone.